All right, so let's get started. And this is a continuation lecture, kind of looking at the economic influences on contemporary American society, but especially on the 2022 election cycle. But as is often the case, there are things that happened in the news this week that I also want to speak with you a little bit about. I think some of them potentially quite significant for the themes we're talking about, even if not directly organized under that rubric. And so it'll be a bit of a transition lecture, a lecture that jumps between a few different themes at the same time. So let's start with the fact that the former president encountered cross currents this last week, as he often does. And on the one hand, at this point, we can now take a look at the results of Trump endorsements in the Republican primaries at the state levels in the 2022 primary cycle. And what we see is a high level of success. And so the idea that I think has been anticipated for a while now, that the Republican Party might break free of the influence of Donald Trump, I still think that we may actually be seeing some signs that that is occurring, but that is not the case with the core base electorate of the Republican Party. And that creates a real dilemma for the Republican Party and a real problem for American democracy, which is that it appears that the Republican Party is going to continue to have a hard time getting officials elected who are not either endorsed by or echoing Trump in terms of their political stance, right? And so this may, in fact, be bad for the Republicans in the general election. It may cost them the Senate. It may drag down their ability to continue to attract, for instance, suburban white women, the kinds of factors that gave Biden his narrow victory in 2020 may in fact continue or be exacerbated in 2022, which is that as we learn more and more about the norm and probably law-breaking activity of the former president, the ability of some run-of-the-mill Republicans to continue to support him and his party is put into question, especially as the party gets more and more closely identified with the former president in terms of the kinds of officials that it is nominating and in terms of their stances on essential issues, like whether or not the election of 2020 was fairly decided, whether or not there should be greater political intervention and supervision in our elections, and whether or not the president should be held, I should say the former president should be held legally accountable for his misdeeds while in office and perhaps before and since as well. And that gets me then to the part of the week that is among the worst weeks for Donald Trump. And let us start with the execution of a warrant to search and seize documents from his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. And as you can see, we now have access to the warrant because it has been unsealed. The Justice Department asked the judge in Florida to remove the secrecy surrounding the warrant, and Donald Trump did not object. And so the result is that we now know on the basis of what the warrant was granted, and it does appear that there is actually serious legal jeopardy for the president associated with the level of secrecy associated with the documents that he retained, that these were the most highly classified documents, that these were documents that were never supposed to leave secure government facilities, not even be in the president's residency in the White House, right? And that that is because if they were to fall into the wrong hands, they present serious national security jeopardy for the United States. The very nature of the documents is that we can only speculate on what they concern. But for instance, nuclear secrets is typically classified. Other top secret military and intelligence documents would be in this same category. And the result is that it appears the former president, violated the Espionage Act by retaining these documents as a private citizen and by not allowing them to be returned to the secure facilities where they're supposed to be stored. And this then raises the familiar dilemma that we've talked about before, which is if a former president, someone who is still politically active, who has not gone into watercolor portraiture, but is very much involved in leading his party, is clearly guilty of violating the law. But if his party continues to support him, can he be prosecuted without generating the appearance that the administration of the criminal law in the United States of America at the federal level has become a partisan payback racket? And I have given you my opinion on this before. I don't think I have anything particularly new or novel to say. The problem is not with the administration of justice. The problem is with the former president's behavior, but even more so with his party. The fact that at the same time that it becomes clear the gravity of the offenses in question, that his party, its elected officials, and would-be candidates rush to defend him and to attack the Department of Justice and FBI, and thereby give credibility to the idea that this is, quote, a partisan witch hunt and not a demand that everyone in the country follow the law, even if you are a former president and very popular political figure. So again, the quandary here is if you don't prosecute, and here it appears that there's no ambiguity about the fact that the former president, has violated the law. If you don't prosecute, then you suggest that the law is not equally applied to everyone in the country. If you do prosecute, you run the risk of creating the impression that the Department of Justice has been politicized. Now, having said that, I think in this case, it is actually, in a sense, too late to avoid that impression, because Donald Trump didn't cooperate after months of negotiation, did not return the documents. The Department of Justice has already, the FBI has already served the warrant, searched the property, removed the documents, and is already being lambasted in the conservative press and by conservative politicians. And so in a sense, the very reaction of the Republican Party may have made Merrick Garland's decision a little bit easier in this case than it is in some other cases. In addition to this new and quite prominent and problematic case, the other cases surrounding Donald Trump continued to progress in the last week or two. So Donald Trump was required to testify in front of a grand jury in order to determine, in the civil case being brought by Letitia James, the Attorney General of the state of New York, about the varying valuation of his assets, especially his property. Did he say one thing when he was filing his taxes and another thing to the banks in order to get loans, or the insurance companies? And in the testimony that Trump was required by a judge to give, he answered exactly one question: "What is your name?" And after that, he invoked his Fifth right, Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate himself over 400 times, right? And in a civil proceeding, unlike in a criminal proceeding, invoking the Fifth can be taken into consideration by the jury in determining the question of whether or not the defendant is liable to being fined. And the fact that Trump has had to do this makes it more likely that he may ultimately agree to a civil fine if Letitia James is willing to settle this case, and that the fine could be steep. Alternatively, it does also increase the likelihood that he may, in fact, be sued for fraud, civil fraud in the state of New York. And then, of course, there are the ongoing investigations into election interference or the invasion of the Capitol and the attempt to overturn the results of the election, the plots in Georgia that are being investigated there by state attorneys and by the Justice Department and Congress. And while the focus has been on what happened in Mar-a-Lago and the handling of classified documents, it does appear that those other two cases are continuing to slowly progress in terms of interviews being conducted, phones and other things being seized, a widening focus in terms of witnesses that seem to be getting closer and closer to the president. So all of that to say, although this is not directly to do with the economy, it is one of the things that is very much on the agenda of American politics as we enter an election season. A quite popular former president remains in serious legal jeopardy, and it is roiling our legal and political system to be in these circumstances. Let me now move back to legislation we discussed in some detail together last week. That is the Inflation Reduction Act that passed the Senate last week and passed the House yesterday, and so now only requires Joe Biden's signature to become law. That should happen any day now. It has substantial climate change initiatives. It has some important measures for bringing healthcare costs down by bringing prescription drug costs down. And it also has an extension of the subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, right? We've talked about all of this. We've looked at the x-ray of it. And now let me spend a moment looking at the climate change component of it, because I think this is very important. We talked a little bit about this in terms of whether to be more optimistic or critical when it comes to this legislation. Should we celebrate it or should we mourn what it doesn't do? And I am going to concentrate on what the legislation doesn't do after just having noted. And I'm doing research on climate change for lectures I'm giving elsewhere. And I came across the fact that the Department of Justice wrote a memorandum to the President of the United States in 1965 predicting climate change and recommending that steps be taken to prevent or mitigate its consequences. Right. And here we are in 2022, and the first dedicated, meaningful climate change legislation is being passed. And so on the one hand, we have to say finally, and we have to recognize that the way in which our legislative process is structured makes it very difficult to pass legislation when vested interests oppose that legislation, and that perhaps among the most powerful vested interests in the United States is the petroleum or carbon lobby. And so that this was a real legislative accomplishment, and it makes it clear that the first 2 years of Joe Biden's presidency are legislatively significant, that he is now an accomplished president. You probably have to go back to Bill Clinton to find a president who has accomplished this much in a single Congress, between the American Rescue Act, the infrastructure bill, this bill, the chips bill, which encourages the manufacturing of microchips in this country. This is legislation that is likely to have significant impacts over the long term. And Joe Biden got it done, and the Democrats got it done, despite the fact that they have the thinnest possible majority in the Senate, right? Literally a tie with the vice president breaking that tie. And so there needs to be some credit given where it is due. And at the same time, we need to recognize the limits of this legislation. And I know there's a lot going on the screen. I will unpack it for you. Somebody showed this diagram too, said, isn't that upside down? It's not upside down. This is reductions in carbon, right, emitted into the atmosphere, metric tons, millions of metric tons, as a matter of fact, and different sources of the reduction. And I'm not going to drill down into the fine matter details in this diagram. I'm just going to point out to you the basic comparisons here, right? And so this is comparing the Inflation Reduction Act with the original Build Back Better Act with a plausible net zero pathway, getting to net zero by 2050. And what the diagram shows is that the Inflation Reduction Act falls short in 2030 of our 2030 target quite substantially, and more so than the original Build Back Better bill would, and also considerably more than we would have to be really on the net zero pathway. And I will just say, as I do every time I discuss this issue, this is an existential threat to human and biological life on planet Earth. This is not the kind of issue on which we should just accept the limits of the American system of government, the fact that we are a bipartisan country and have to therefore compromise. Yes, on other legislative issues, we may say, let's get what we can when we can. On this issue, I think we have to really continue to say, although this is an accomplishment, although this is an important mark of the legislative success of Biden and the Democrats, it is still obviously inadequate. And so I want to look for a moment. This is meant to be a lecture on economic issues, at a economic analysis of climate change. And this diagram envisions a what they call orderly and a disorderly transition into a less fossil fuel dependent economy. And let me read the analysis for just a moment. And it is a little technical, but I think it still makes sense. Simulations suggest that an orderly transition that features a timely increase in green energy investment could impose relatively small near-term costs and delivery persistent long-term gains. And deliver persistent long-term gains, measured in terms of economic output. By contrast, a disorderly shift where the adoption of clean energy technology lags, but carbon-intensive energy sources are shut down, rapidly would involve significant costs, both in the short and the long term. And by the way, this comes from the Bank for International Settlements. This is not a pro climate an environmental organization. This is an organization whose business it is to look after the health of national and private banks, right? And the organization is saying to us, there is at this point a drag on the world's economy that annually amounts to trillions of dollars from the fact that we have to mitigate or repair the damage that extreme weather does, from the cost to insurance agencies of having to insure against increased risk and actual harm, from the loss of crops and economic productivity, etc. Right? And so please note that their scenarios include that an international depression could be prompted by the need to rapidly transition away from fossil-based fuel, carbon-intensive energy in this decade, right? And so even if we're not being purely environmental in our perspective in this, but also being economic or concerned with the fiscal health of this country, we have to be concerned that this measure has come up short at the same time that we have to celebrate its accomplishments. I now want to shift into the economic context proper. And I will start by noting what was trimmed from this bill. And among the things that were trimmed from this bill, right, substantial subsidies for the construction of new housing in the United States, right? And I focused there. Last week, I indicated to you that there's an economist, Jenny Schuetz, who suggests that the US economy is 36% smaller than it would be if we solved the housing problems that are plaguing us, that a substantial portion of the American population is now housing stressed. A large portion of the population is severely housing stressed, spending more than 50% of its income on housing. And yet we didn't do this, right? And by the way, child tax credits, that's another place I want to concentrate today, made a dramatic impact on childhood poverty. And I'm about to get into this, but if you remember in the American Rescue Act, the first big piece of legislation Biden passed with the Democratic support in the very first month of his presidency, it increased the child tax credit. And the result was a dramatic reduction in childhood poverty. That is not in the legislation that actually passed, right? Nor universal preschool, right? So almost everything that passed is in the climate and environment or healthcare portion of the bill. The basically 4/5 of this bill that was eliminated has to do with families and other things that would restore a more cooperative and equal or fair America. And I now want to try to say for a moment why that's so important. And I pointed out to you last week that we have become a much more unequal society over the last 50 plus years. And this diagram is just to refresh your memory, see it from another perspective. This diagram helps us to see what this means concretely. One thing I pointed out to you last week, and I will return to it in a moment, is that basically the bottom 50% of the American population owns no wealth, zero wealth. basically $500 or less in their savings account, no property that is worth anything, that it's either the case that they're renting or that their mortgage is underwater. And the result is, of course, that wealth is highly concentrated in the United States. But if we look at this in terms of income, and I've shown you this before, but I just think it's worthwhile remembering, right? That basically almost 50% of the American population earns $30,000 a year or less. And of that, right, 12% is earning less than 5,000. Another 7% earning less than 10,000, right? And so the term that sociologists use, the precariat, right? That we just have a large number of precarious people in our society, and that the economic data that we look at, as well as the legislation that passes or doesn't get passed, always has to be viewed in that context. We are returning to the levels of inflation, to take another example, of the 1980s, the early 1980s, and yet the economy is much more unequal. People are much more vulnerable than they were in the 1980s. And so, right, we can see what the fact that we've become more unequal is doing to us. Intergenerational economic mobility is way down, right? So this is the fraction of children doing better than their parents is basically down to 50-50 in the current decade. It used to be that 90% or more of children were doing better than their parents economically, right? And this is, among other things, giving rise to severe economic stress and anxiety, as reflected in the increase in deaths of despair. And I've shown you, I'm just going to review quickly, that more unequal societies are more unhealthy, unhappy, and socially dysfunctional societies. They are worse places to live across the board. This is a very strong correlation among all developed societies. It's not true for less developed societies. That we know the fundamental underlying variable here, and it has to do with stress and anxiety, and in particular with the kind of social evaluative anxiety that living in a highly unequal society generates. In an unequal society, people are constantly evaluating themselves relative to other people, because your place in the social hierarchy, in the hierarchy of wealth and income and status, matters more. You constantly look below and above to see where you are. This is deeply rooted in our hardwired psychology. We are ultimately social primates. And the result is, as I've tried to argue with you, right, that I think the data is very clear that in high inequality societies like the United States has become, everyone is worse off. And what that means is that even the people who are best off in our society are experiencing more economic stress than everyone except the bottom third in a medium inequality society, than everyone except for perhaps the bottom 10% in a low inequality society. So this is obviously worse for the least well off, for the poor and precarious. But having said that, it is bad for everyone. It is in everyone's interest, really, to live in a more equal society. But again, this is the context in which we have to look at this data. And the fact that we are in a society that is more unequal, in which access to opportunity is more scarce, has rendered us a more competitive, a less cooperative society. This is a society in which life is harder, in which people are less willing to be generous. Again, this is just background for thinking about than the economic data. I focused last week on Thomas Piketty, the French economist who has gotten a lot of attention and renown over the last 15 or so years, path breaking research that he and a team of other economists have done, really using large databases, primarily of tax records, but of other records as well, to reconstruct the history of equality and inequality. In his most recent work, Piketty summarizes and updates this research by showing the big trend lines of the 20th century. This is just another way of coming at this, that in terms of income inequality, we went from being highly unequal to much more equal to highly unequal again. In terms of wealth inequality, in terms of assets that people own, the top 10% did see their position eroded quite substantially by the Great Depression and progressive taxation, but then it came back substantially, especially in the United States. The big difference of the 20th century is the creation of an upper middle class, right? And the idea that there is now a group in the top half, but not in the top 10%. So that 40% of the population who went from having about 10% of the property to having something like 30% of the property. Governmental programs had a lot to do with creating that upper middle class, but those programs did not extend to the bottom 50%, who basically remain excluded from wealth possession, certainly are in no position to transmit that wealth intergenerationally. Part of the reason we have so little mobility is that we know, and the way in which Piketty refers to the middle class in the United States and Europe is as a patrimonial middle class, meaning that they are middle class because wealth is transmitted across generations, not because they generate their own wealth in their own generation. We know that if you have no wealth, it is very likely that your descendants, that your children and their children will also have no wealth in a society where the laws of the market govern who does and doesn't have wealth. Unless we deliberately promote wealth redistribution, we're going to remain a society in which wealth is highly and in all likelihood just all the more unequally distributed. So with that context, I'll just refresh your memory. Piketty has a very simple, radical proposal: universal basic inheritance, right? That everybody at their middle of the 20s gets a payout from the government that amounts to 60% of the average wealth in the society. Doesn't make you rich, but brings you up to a comparable level with the average in your society. And that this proposal can be financed by taxing the very wealthy people who have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on an annual basis, and by taxing inheritances more aggressively than we do, and by making property and inheritance taxation progressive. Right now, they are flat taxes, generally speaking. And so somebody who owns a $200,000 house and somebody who owns a $2 million home pays the same level of taxation. The person with $2 million pays more because their home is worth more, but they pay at the same rate. And so Piketty's other proposal here is that we make property taxation, wealth taxation, and inheritance taxation progressive, that we don't have to tax very high for even people who are quite rich, 100 times the average wealth. So people in this country who have uh, $20 million, I believe that would only have an annual tax rate on their wealth 10%, an inheritance tax rate of 70%. It's the people who are whose wealth is denominated in billions, not millions of dollars, who would pay what Piketty calls confiscatory tax rates that would really reduce their wealth, not to the point where they had none, but to the point where it did not generate huge amounts of social power that distort democratic politics. And the consequence of this would be, right, that we would have a much more even distribution of wealth. In particular, the bottom 50%, as opposed to owning almost nothing, would own about a third of the wealth in our society. Now, I'm reviewing this. I want to move on to Piketty's second recommendation in the context of contemporary American politics in an election year, because I think the second recommendation is the one that is more politically realistic and relevant for America in the 2020s. I don't think that there's anything unattainable about Piketty's proposal, and he goes into great detail on this proposal for universal basic inheritance, great detail to show that high rates of taxation do not interfere with economic growth, do not remove incentives for entrepreneurs, et cetera. So that there's really no reason to believe that this is not a viable proposal economically, even if it's not viable politically. But the second aspect of Piketty's proposal is that we restore, I should say, progressive income tax, right? And that the progressive income tax be used to fund a robust welfare state. And that's where the Build Back Better legislation is important, and where the Inflation Reduction Act really sacrificed, right? Is in those proposals that would have created more housing for not only low but middle income people, that would have extended the child tax credit that pulled so many children out of poverty, that would have further increased access to healthcare, to early childhood care, pre-K, et cetera, right? And so to take a little bit of a survey of the kinds of economic issues that are facing the United States in 2022, I want to refresh your memory about what we did in 2021, right? And this is the effects of the American Rescue Act and the temporary pandemic safety net it erected, and then the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act did not extend these programs. And I've got a whole list here. There are a couple, right? So the ACA, American Care Act, or Obamacare Act, eligibility and subsidies have been maintained for another 3 years by the Inflation Reduction Act. Student loan forbearance, it appears, will continue for the foreseeable future. But the eviction protection, obviously the stimulus payments are gone unless you're a Californian. The unemployment insurance supplements, the child tax credit, the increased food benefits, all of that is gone, right? And so I just want to spend a minute surveying what it did, and to point out to you that it reduced poverty. It made economically precarious people a little bit more secure for a year, and to hold out the possibility, as Piketty puts it, that the agenda of 21st century politics should include restoring progressive income tax so that we can support a more robust welfare state. So if you look right, poverty came down for every age group between 2018 and 2021 as a result of the American Rescue Act provisions and benefits, right? Especially it came down in children. It came down for every racial group. It came down for every geographic group as well. And to put this in perspective, this is right a 50-year perspective on the fluctuations in the poverty rate in the United States. These are 3-year change perspectives. What you can see is that in 2021, poverty came down by 40%, right? In no other year in the last 50 years did it come down by 20%, right? And so when it does come down from 1970 to 2021, it's almost exclusively because of economic growth. And economic growth can reduce poverty, but not nearly as quickly or to the degree that governmental policy can. And so we need to digest this. We need to learn this lesson. We can see in a little bit more detail here the way the different components of the American Rescue Act worked together to reduce poverty, right? Whether it's unemployment benefits, which of course depends on whether or not people lost their jobs, but there were significant enhancements to unemployment benefits, the stimulus checks, the food stamp increase for families that are relying, it says food stamps, really it should say SNAP, right? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the child tax credits, where I'm going to focus, right? You can see $5,000 more for a poor family, single parent with 2 kids. And you put this all together, right? And these families are lifted out of poverty, economic insecurity, and precariousness by legislation that we could make permanent, right? And so when we think about what's at stake in looking at the economy, part of what we need to think about is how many people in the richest country in the world are economically insecure. And we're not talking exclusively about the officially poor. We're really talking about the bottom 50% of our population. This legislation, the suite of legislation in the American Rescue Act, reduced hunger, especially for families with children, dramatically, right? From 16% of families experiencing hunger on a weekly basis to only around 10%. It reduced vulnerability around household expenses overall, right? Nearly a quarter of Americans with children experiencing an inability to make their funds last over the whole week and cover all their household expenses, down to about 13%. It decreased housing insecurity as well. Please note, right, that 15% of Americans were behind on their housing payments, their rent or their mortgage in December of 2020 before the legislation was passed. That number goes up and down, but it's pretty stubbornly in the territory of 13 to 14%. It gets driven down to 10% by this legislation. That's still too high, but it's obviously better. Overall economic anxiety, and as I've emphasized to you, this is perhaps the single most important variable in accounting for the overall health and well-being in a society. And as you can see right, tremendously high levels of economic anxiety, approaching 3/4 of the people surveyed who have children experiencing economic anxiety in a week. That's driven down to a little bit more than 50%. So, a really substantial reduction in economic anxiety. And then we've talked together several times about the deaths of despair literature. Is your economic anxiety so high that you're feeling depression? 60% of families with children, that is the case for before the legislation is passed. It's driven down to less than 50% as a result of the legislation. Obviously, still too high, but it does show that if we were to collect the taxes, if we were to fund the programs do work. When we look at what specifically was done with the child tax credit, right? People used it on food, utilities, rent or mortgage, clothing, and education, right? That they used it where you think they should use it. And by the way, across the board, they continued to work. People did not treat this, as some critics suggested they might, as an excuse to drop out of the labor force and live in the dole. I'm sorry, but $4,000 to $7,500 is certainly not enough to live. It is enough, perhaps, to pull a working family out of poverty or to make them better able to afford some of their basic expenses. And so when we look at the economic data, like I'm about to do in a little bit more detail, we have to bear in mind, right, that a substantial portion of the American population was already experiencing severe economic insecurity, precariousness, and anxiety before inflation started to take off, before we got to the period we're in now, where there's so many difficult economic cross currents, right? For final piece on this, to just show you, right, the rate of reduction of poverty for children across the board, white children, Black children, Latino children, Asian children, everybody was benefited from this legislation. And these are not small changes. 30% reduction in childhood poverty. So now let me go back to inflation, and we got new data. The 8.5% inflation, the first reduction in 20 months. We got that last week. We also got a breakdown, right, in terms of where prices are continuing to increase, but also where they've gone down. The big factor here is things related to oil, whether that's fuel, airfare, gasoline, or utility gas services, right, all coming down. I want to spend a few minutes talking with you now about inflation. We've reviewed some of its effects. I think the most important effect, of course, is that when inflation exceeds wage growth, it decreases the actual value of compensation. We see wages basically worth in 2022, in the summer of 2022, about 3% less than they were worth a year ago, right? And that means that Americans are having a hard time affording what they were buying a year ago. That the cost of the same basket of goods is about 5,000 more on average. And so people are feeling much less secure, much less confident in terms of the economy. I looked, as I was starting to say, at some data on this, and there's Federal Reserve data on this. There's also the Bank of International Settlements, which has its its new report for 2022 was published in June. And I find this diagram to be really illuminating. And it's of course not easy to make out at first, but what it does is it kind of cross tabulates or shows spillover effects of inflation. And it compares two periods. 1965 to 1985 is on the left, and that's a period of relatively high inflation. Inflation starts to become a concern in the second half of the 1960s and then really gets out of control in the 1970s into the first half of the 1980s. And then this period, 1986 to 2019, which is a very low inflation period. It's a period where inflation essentially stops being an issue at the macroeconomic level. And what you can see here is that in a relatively high inflationary period, what happens is not isolated increases in expenses in particular goods, right? Which you can see, right? There are some items, some boxes in this diagram that are relatively dark red. That means that a increase in costs in one area led to an increase in cost in another area. The classic example here is oil costs, because practically everything has to be transported using gasoline or jet fuel or ship fuel. And the result is that if the cost of oil goes up, the cost of everything goes up. Well, it turns out that there are those spillover effects in many categories in a high inflation environment. And that what is really worrying about the last 20 months, the last 2 years of inflation, is that what appeared to be inflation initially in a few categories of goods, right? That automobiles were going up because of supply chain issues that were caused ultimately by COVID, that gasoline prices were going up because of oil market instability caused by Russia invading the Ukraine, is beginning to look more like the inflation of the 1970s, in which the cost in one category causes spillover in many other categories, and the overall value of the dollar is as a result eroded. So, right, not just that you have to pay more for a car or more to fill that car with gasoline, but that your salary is worth $5,000 less because everything you buy costs more. And so I think that, at least for me, helped me to better understand what it is the Fed is trying to combat in terms of inflation, and why it is that inflation in 2022 is perhaps a more pronounced and dangerous problem than it was in 2021. Having said all that, I would also point out to you that there are different ways of thinking about what will happen as a result of the Fed's efforts to raise interest rates, to tighten the money supply, to make it such that people spend less, corporations spend less, and then ultimately prices will come down. Do remember that inflation right now is a global phenomenon. It's not just an American phenomenon. As you can see in Europe, in the US, in the UK, and in Canada, inflation in all of these large economic zones is up around 8% to 10%. By the way, there's some efforts to try to calculate inflation in China, but the data is so unreliable, it's very difficult to do. This comes again from the Bank of International Settlements. And just very quickly, right, when we talk about a soft landing versus a hard landing, this has in part to do with whether or not growth continues, right? Or how much GDP is reduced by increased interest rates. And I think one of the things to see here, right, is that when we have a hard landing, the growth rate may appear to be decent, but because inflation has remained stubborn, there's actually a contraction being camouflaged by the fact that what is being produced is being measured in inflated dollars. And so in a hard landing scenario, families have less to spend. The economy is not as strong overall. Inflation is more stubborn and more persistent. The stock market contracts, etc. Right? And so I think what we are dealing with in terms of inflation and economic policy is a question: how much and how quickly do we get back to a scenario in which we can have price increases in particular quantities or categories, I should say, of goods? Or do we find ourselves in this scenario in which this is spilling over, reinforcing, and all goods are becoming more expensive? And I'll just conclude today by reminding you of what we looked at together last week. And I think seeing it in this light helps to think a little bit more about what we've discussed today. Wages in the United States have been stagnant or declining. Household income has been stagnant, but only because people are working more. People desire goods. Many of these goods have become more expensive, but because they don't have spillover effects, right? Many of them have become less expensive due to globalization, and overall inflation has not been a systematic problem eroding people's purchasing power. But let us look for a moment at some of the details here, right? Childcare, highly inflationary. Housing, highly inflationary. Education costs and medical care costs. These are the factors that, prior to the current spate of inflationary pressure, were already increasing rapidly, but being offset by costs in other goods. Those are all issues, the affordability of which was tackled by the Build Back Better bill, and that stuff that was ultimately sacrificed to get Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema on board to get this across the finish line. We have serious long-term economic problems that are not being addressed in the current legislative agenda or political cycle. I'll stop there. I suspect people have questions or comments. Who wants to start us out? And I went through, right, at least three different issues: the vulnerability of President Trump or former President Trump to prosecution, the environmental evaluation of the climate change reduction aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the more narrowly economic considerations. Who wants to start us out today? Flossie, you're lit up, but you're muted. I can't tell if you're talking because I can't see your face. Now it looks like you're talking, but you're still muted. Flossie, I cannot hear you. You would have to hit the space bar if you're trying to talk.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Somehow, oddly enough, I feel that what is happening to the Republican Party is that they are absolutely cutting their own throats. And that's somewhat hopeful, because we seem to be moving at least in the right direction. We're trying to do what little we can. I say we, the Democrats. We can't give our country the whole package. Our hands are tied any more than we can hang Trump right now. But there may be reason to later. So I'm hopeful. We're moving in the right direction. There will be blood. There always will be blood, but it will be maybe not in great quantities.
I'm going to stick away from blood,
Yes.
but what I will say is, if you look at the polling data, Biden's approval rating is continuing to come up.
Again.
If you look at the generic
Yes.
ballot, the favorability of Democrats over Republicans is edging up ever so slightly. If you look at the prediction for the Senate, now that it's all but settled who all the candidates will be,
Yes.
the likelihood of the Democrats holding the Senate has increased. It's frankly still very unlikely that the Democrats are going to hold the House. And so even if the Democrats increase their majority in the Senate and are no longer dependent on Manchin and Sinema, it doesn't mean that they're going to be any better able to legislate. In fact, it may be that if the Republicans gain control of the House, the legislative portion of Biden's presidency is over for this term. We'll have to see what happens if he runs, but that's too far away to even worry about right now. But so having said all of that, Flossie, I think you may be right that there is some cost being paid by the Republican Party for their continued association with a highly polarizing figure, a man who mobilizes the base but repels a lot of people and has growing legal problems. Does this result in the Republican Party fundamentally collapsing, or alternatively reforming itself? And obviously, political earthquakes are impossible to foresee, but I really don't see that scenario as very likely right now. And so the alternative scenario is simply that the Democrats continue to do a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, and eventually are able to assemble a successful legislative majority. And that's not impossible, but given the skew in the Senate in terms of 2 votes per state, and there being a lot of low population, rather conservative states in terms of gerrymandering, etc., I'm just a little concerned that that's a very hard path to take. So yes, 2022, the Democrats may do a little better because the Republican Party continues to be associated with a very troubled former president. But
and associated with somebody like Ted Cruz,
yeah,
who asks the opposition to kiss his ass. And if that's what the Republican Party brings us, they're out of luck. I mean, Manchin next to Cruz.
So Jeanette has a question as well, or at least you raised your hand. Where are you? I'm having trouble seeing you. There you are. Go ahead. Yep.
All right. The idea of giving a big hunk of money to people to young people, especially young people who were, from a poor background, just seems like the chances of their spending it well would be so poor. And rich people help their children primarily by sending them to school, by helping them buy houses, and also by their contacts. And when I look at the chart, it seems like a lot of the progress we made in inequality came after World War II and was probably a result of the GI Bill. And that provided education and help with housing for white GIs, at least.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we don't need something like a universal service kind of thing where people could do volunteer work and then afterward be eligible for education and help with housing.
It sounds like a great idea to me, Jeanette. And to be clear, and I'll just give you Piketty's answer very quickly. He doesn't think it's either or. He thinks it's both and, right? So that we need to, and that's why I emphasized what was in the American Recovery Act, and the way in which, when we really concentrated on the safety net, we pulled a lot of people out of rather desperate poverty for a short while, and that could be done on a more stable basis. And Piketty is all in favor of that, right? And so, among other things that Piketty would say is, look, you got a housing shortage, federal government needs to tax, and the federal government needs to subsidize the construction of housing, right? It can still be privately owned. You can do what the Netherlands does, which is essentially to give everybody a start of life down payment grant and an affordable mortgage. But put people in a situation where they can go to where the jobs are, and then put them in a situation where they can also accumulate some wealth by owning their home. So yes, the stuff that was in the GI Bill, you emphasize the education, I'm emphasizing the housing, but do that. But what Piketty points out, and I'll just be as clear as possible about this, is two things. The first is that wealth does not equalize itself, right? That 500 years of economic data shows that over time, inequality in wealth increases across generations. It doesn't decrease. And second of all, that being excluded from wealth has all kinds of life consequences, right? It makes you take a bad job. It increases you to stress. It prevents you from getting education. It often prevents people from starting and stabilizing their lives. You may be right that if you just gave everybody, when they turned 18, $200,000, half of them would have lost it all by the time they were 25, right? Yes. And so you may need to, and Piketty is totally open to this, experiment, figure out what works, what doesn't work. Maybe you should get 20,000 a year every year for 10 years. Maybe you should get half of it when you turn 20 and the other half when you turn 30. Maybe there should be some conditions on what you can do and can't do with it, right? But the general idea, it seems to me, of making our society a less unequal society, not only in terms of income, but also in terms of wealth, I think is an extremely important idea. And it's coupled with this idea that if you don't do something to equalize wealth, wealth gets translated into social power, into political power, and then it gets used to reinforce the underlying inequality in wealth. Barbara, you've got your hand up?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a friendly amendment to Jeanette's assertion that if you give poor people money, they are not necessarily going to spend it wisely. I think your chart showed us that with the child tax credit, whatever that was, that the money was spent the way those of us who live in Piedmont Gardens would have spent it, on food and housing and education. Something like 91% was spent
exactly
in those ways. So let's be careful not to paint too broad a brush about judgment and values.
And that's why I think it's important to experiment. The child tax credit was small relative to what Piketty is proposing, right? Maybe $7,500 at most. Piketty is proposing, $150,000, $200,000. The child tax credit went exclusively to people who have children, right? And that can be something that creates a more mature economic perspective or priorities once you have children, right? And so I don't want to completely dismiss Jeanette's concerns. I think it's a matter of determining what kind of policy works. I think another thing to point out, as some of you know, I taught at Deep Springs College, and at Deep Springs College, they ask the 18 to 20-year-old college students to basically run the place, to cook the food, to clean the toilets, et cetera, and so on. And remarkably enough, they do it, and they do it well. And the lesson I took from that is that sometimes when you ask people to be responsible, they actually will be responsible. They will rise to the demands of their situation. John, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Morally, the happiest event in the recent spate of policymaking, and maybe important economically as well, was the refinancing of the IRS so they can hire a lot more agents to go against tax cheats. And it is, well, cheats is maybe a little strong, but more aggressive auditing of high income tax returns. And that actually has the potential of making quite a lot of difference. There are a lot of statistics showing that the amount of taxes paid by well-off people as compared to what they should be paying is remarkably low. And that could improve things a good deal.
Yeah, I'm just going to show real quick so we can all see it together. And I'm sorry for moving through this so fast, but I got to get way back to the beginning. The amount that they think they will get through enforcement, right, in this bill is approaching, what is that?
125.
Well, 315 plus 125, right? So that's enforcement, and some of that is an increase in the tax. This is the Janet Yellen proposal, but some of it is just straight out enforcement, and then 125 billion dollars with a B from enforcement. Yeah, I'm not sure that's the happiest part of the legislation. I'm inclined to think that the climate change stuff might actually be something that we will be more inclined to celebrate 50 or 100 years from now, if it manages to be the start of a snowball in which we finally address the most urgent issue in the world. But having said that, agreed that it is important. What would be really important is if we coupled better enforcement with more progressive taxation, right? And then we would really begin to reconstitute the basis for the state to do good things at the same time that we began to attack inequality. All right, everyone. Great being with you guys. Take care. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye, everybody. And by the way, we won't continue with the economic stuff. We'll move on. Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.